This is Dr. Paris, and this week we'll be discussing the first half of our chapter on Judaism. We're going to address an often misunderstood phrase from Scripture. Our examination of this phrase will take us back to Gandhi and the Jain concept of nonviolence, and we'll also continue exploring the ancient Near Eastern world that we encountered in our last chapter. But first, let's talk about the Old Testament, or what scholars refer to as the Hebrew Bible. Now, it's perfectly acceptable for Christians to use the term Old Testament. But, to be more inclusive to Jews, we use the term Hebrew Bible in an academic setting. The Hebrew Bible contains the 39 books of the Christian Old Testament, but they're in a different order. Jews refer to their scriptures as Tanakh. Matthews defines Tanakh as the complete Jewish Bible comprising 3 parts: Torah, which are the first 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings, and the first 3 letters of these terms yield Tanakh. We'll discuss the Torah in a moment, but let's talk about the Nevi'im, or prophets. In Tanakh, the prophets begin with Joshua and Judges. Most Christians would call these historical books. However, they are prophets in Judaism. One interesting thing to note when we get to the Ketuvim, or the writings, is that the book of Daniel is part of the writings in Judaism. In addition to Daniel, we read about Ruth and Esther in the Ketuvim. Matthews identifies the Torah as the first 5 books of the Bible, consisting of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Another name for the Torah is the Pentateuch, so called because there are 5 books. The Pentateuch contains a lot of narratives, but many people associate it with the Mosaic Law. One of the most important things we read in the Torah is a monotheistic statement known as the Shema. In Hebrew, Shema means hear. It's the first word of Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. It's recited in Hebrew, and I'll recite it for you now, reading right to left, which is the opposite of how we read English. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. You'll note there that I use the word Adonai. The word is actually Yahweh in Hebrew, but Jews do not use the sacred name of God, so instead they substitute the word Adonai, which means Lord. Now we want to focus on a law from the Hebrew Bible that you've probably all heard about. It is known as Lex Talionis, or the law of retribution. But you probably know it as an eye for an eye. And here we have the scriptures that give us Lex Talionis. First of all, Exodus 21:24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, speaking about retribution. And then Leviticus 24:19 through 20. If anyone maims his fellow as he has done, so it shall be done to him. There's the idea of revenge. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury he inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. Now, many people have criticized the concept of an eye for eye. Gandhi, who was influenced by the Ahisma, or nonviolence of the Jains, said, an eye for an eye makes the world blind. Martin Luther King Jr. said something similar. And finally, the character Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof has a quote in the musical in which he speaks of the whole world being blind and toothless. Now, I agree with their call for an end to violence, but is that what the scripture actually meant in its ancient context? I'm not completely disagreeing with Gandhi, MLK, and Tevye, however, I have a point to make, so I'm going to create a thesis that recognizes their point of view, and here it is. But while recognizing their point of view, I'm going to state mine. So, my thesis is, although Gandhi and others are correct to decry the violence perpetuated by the most prominent interpretation of Lex Talionis, a look at an eye for an eye in its original context reveals that Lex Talionis is a call for social equality because it does not privilege the rich over the poor in legal matters. Now that I've shared my thesis, I'm going to prove it. First, I'm going to admit that the idea is not entirely mine. I'll be adding my own thoughts on this subject, but I was inspired by the work of Moshe Greenberg in his article, Some Postulates of Biblical Criminal Law, and if I were writing a paper, I'd need to cite him in my bibliography. Greenberg's article contrasts the Hebrew Bible with ancient Near Eastern law. He notes that in the A&E, the gods decide who gets to be king, but the kings make the laws. In contrast, God gives the law in the Hebrew Bible. God is the author of the law. Moses is merely the secretary. Now, we do see instances of God writing the law on tables of stone in the Old Testament, but in most cases, Moses writes down the laws. Now that I've made my point, I want to consider what it means. According to Greenberg, that means that Israelite law contains more than legal codes. In fact, it goes beyond the law because it contains social and moral positions. In the United States, we spend a great deal of time talking about whether or not we can legislate morality. Many say that we can't because of the separation of church and state. Others disagree. Now, while that's an interesting debate, we're going to stick to the ancient Near East and contrast it with the Hebrew Bible today. First, let's talk about two types of law in the Hebrew Bible. We have apodictic laws, which are unconditional commands. An example is, you shall have no other gods before me. That's one of the 10 Commandments. Another type of law is casuistic law or case law. It's conditional law. Most likely, these laws were based on actual cases. Our example here follows the if X then Y format. If you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you must return it to him before the sun sets. Now, much of our law in the United States is based on case law. We have precedents. If a case was ruled a certain way by the Supreme Court years ago, then we can use it to interpret our laws today. Of course, we're having more and more difficulty figuring out our laws because we don't have laws in the books for things like cyberbullying. Morality tells us it's wrong. The law doesn't specifically say it isn't. However, there may be cases where we can argue against cyberbullying, but the law is not specific enough about it yet. A great deal of our ideas about morality in American and Western culture come from the Hebrew Bible. Plus, this type of morality is not found in ancient Near Eastern law. For example, Exodus 23, 4 through 5 says, when you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering, you must take it back to him. When you see the donkey of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with him. Notice that the Hebrew Bible tells its readers to help their enemies. A lot of people think Jesus was doing something entirely new when he talked about loving your enemies. However, I'd argue that he based a lot of his teachings on the Hebrew Bible. What he said was definitely important and innovative, but he certainly had a strong base to draw his preaching from. The Hebrew Bible provides us with a holistic approach to law. It is legal and moral. Although many people try to separate the two in the U.S., the Hebrew Bible does not. For example, Leviticus 19:18 says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. Noticing this is not talking not about your action, but about your attitude. It's not just about taking vengeance. That could be an action, but it's bearing a grudge. That's something inside of you. Now, oftentimes, students will tell me that the God of the Old Testament is very vengeful, while Jesus is the loving God of the New Testament. However, I think that we can see a lot of compassion and mercy in the Hebrew Scriptures. I think that sometimes students overgeneralize the Bible because they know a lot more about the New Testament than they know about the Old. If we add the legal plus the moral, then we get compassion. Biblical morality creates compassion for widows, orphans, strangers, and the old, as we see in Leviticus 19:32 through 34. You shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, am your God. In the A&E world, kings would proclaim their greatness by saying that they cared for widows and orphans. And if you really wanted to criticize a leader, you would say that they don't care about widows and orphans. But the Hebrew Bible is telling everyone to care about them. Now we get to the heart of the matter in A&E law versus the Hebrew Bible. We'll see that the morality of the Hebrew Bible will not allow some A&E laws to stand. That's because A&E law depends on whether or not you are an Awilum, a Muskenum, or a slave. An Awilum is an upper-class person, an aristocrat. A Muskenum is a commoner or someone who is part of the middle class. Finally, slaves are the lowest members of society. You'll remember how we talked about the problems in the caste system in India. Well, we're seeing something similar here. Hammurabi was an ancient Babylonian king who created a law code. As we can see from this law code, punishments depended on social class. For example, in laws 196 to 197, if an aristocrat puts out another aristocrat's eye or breaks his bones, then the same thing happens to him. However, if he puts out the eye of a freed man, then he pays 1 gold mina. That would be someone of a lower class. And if he puts out the eye of a slave or breaks the bone of a slave, then he pays 1/2 the value of the slave. Basically, the Code of Hammurabi is saying that you can hurt those of lesser social status as long as you are willing to pay a fee. The various examples of case law show the superiority of Hebrew Bible over other A&E laws. Among the Hittites and Assyrians, a person could get away with murder as long as he was of a higher class and could pay off the family. The whole system was based on valuing property over humanity. Slaves were property, so they could be killed or injured as long as the inciter of violence paid money. Additionally, property was more important than life because in Hittite and Middle Assyrian law and in the Code of Hammurabi, theft would yield the death penalty. In contrast, the Bible never imposes the death penalty for private property rights. Death is only mandated for intentional homicide and for religious and sexual offenses. A religious offense would be causing someone to worship other gods, and adultery was punishable by death. The Hebrew Bible is better than the A&E because a person cannot get away with murder because of wealth. Numbers 35, 31 through 34 says, "You may not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of a capital crime. He must be put to death. Nor may you accept ransom in lieu of flight to a city of refuge, enabling one to return to live on his land before the death of the priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I myself abide, for I, the Lord, abide among the Israelite people." So, we can see that an eye for an eye is not about violence. It's about equality. The rich should not be able to maim and kill the poor without consequence. Of course, we have to ask ourselves, are we better than the ancient Israelites? In our own culture, we hear of rich people, movie stars, and sports figures paying off people for injuries and sometimes even death. Perhaps we would have a more just system if we accepted the concept of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth as the Hebrew Bible intended it to be. It's not about making the world blind. It's about opening our eyes to injustice and giving the legal system the teeth to punish those who would try to buy their way out of jail. And as we come to our key terms, think about the way I presented my argument. I started with a they say, I say thesis. I had done some research and I referenced that article. I gave examples from the Bible and A&E law. I didn't just state facts, but I considered their implications. You should approach your paper in the same way. It's not a bad idea to go ahead and put an outline together and create a working thesis. Finally, in thinking about these terms, remember that we're splitting up the chapter on Judaism. We'll discuss modern Judaism next week. Until then, I say Mazel Tov, which means good luck.